and welcome to the new series of Our Say Digital Democracy interviews. I'm Tracy Hutchison. Our guest today is Australia's Human Rights Commissioner Tim Wilson. Tim comes to the role from an unusual ideological viewpoint. Formerly at the Institute of Public Affairs and very much on the conservative side of politics, our Freedom Commissioner is a far cry from the liberal lawyers and welfare advocates who often occupy this high office. Never one to be put in a box, Tim's passionately advocated for same-sex marriage, an issue that's deeply divided conservative politics in Australia this week. Today, Tim's going to answer the 3 top questions submitted by and voted on by you, the Our Say community. 94 questions were submitted by 1,000 people, casting 5,660 votes. It's been a really lively debate on a whole range of issues, and the forum wasn't closed until midday today. Those top 3 questions in broad subject areas are the right to die, people concerned about the health impact of various wireless communication technologies, and the decriminalisation of marijuana. Those winning Our Say questioners will join us shortly and put their questions directly to Tim. But first, Tim, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, but I'm going to have to be really difficult. Firstly, I don't describe myself as a conservative. I describe myself as a classical liberal. And I actually strongly disagree that I don't have a natural pedigree in the space of human rights, because human rights came from classical liberal political philosophy. In fact, it's ordinarily been the left side of the political spectrum who have disliked human rights because they prioritise the interests of the individual against government.
I'm so glad that we've got you here for Our Say, because you're off to a flying start.
Subtlety is not my strength.
I also want to ask you, because there's been some conjecture around what we actually call you. Do we call you the Freedom Commissioner or the Human Rights Commissioner?
I'm called Australia's Human Rights Commissioner. That is the office that I hold under law, but the government dubbed me the Freedom Commissioner because that was their policy at the election. They were going to establish an office, and then they just appointed to me this role and said, well, your focus is on freedom. And of course, the relationship between human rights and freedom is almost identical, so you fulfill that role anyway.
When you think about the essence of liberty, where does the balance between individual rights and the greater good for the community sit with you?
Well, it's a very difficult question to answer because it depends to the extent that the greater good also advances the rights of others. Now, as Human Rights Commissioner, but also as a private citizen, I would defend very strongly that people have their individual rights. They should be preserved and respected, and people should be free to be able to exercise them. And it's primarily when they come into contest with other people's rights that you can justify a limitation. So you can exercise your free speech, but nobody disputes there are limits. When you intimidate another person or incite violence, that can be a legitimate basis to restrict it. But you have freedom of thought and conscience, and that's unlimited because it is purely about what you're thinking within your mind. When you come to collective aspirations, there is simply no straightforward answer. Of course, we know that there can be tensions between individual rights and environmental or social impacts, and we have to be mindful of balancing that tension based on those issues.
I'm looking forward to hearing more of what you've got to say throughout our Say conversation. Tim Wilson is with us. Well, our first Our Say questioner is Sarah Edelman, with her question on the right of individuals to end their own lives. Sarah.
Hi, Tim, and thanks for taking this question. My question is...
Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yep. The Liberal Party prides itself as a party standing up for personal freedom, self-reliance and self-determination. Yet those on the conservative side of politics are the most fervent opponents to voluntary assisted dying and have consistently voted down bills that sought its legislation. Surely, when a person is terminally ill and suffering, the ability to determine the manner and the timing of their death should be a fundamental human right. As Freedom Commissioner, are you prepared to stand up for the rights of Australians who want this choice? Thank you.
Well, first, thank you very much for the question. I actually talked specifically about this in my National Press Club address earlier in the year. It's actually a question that's regularly raised with me around the challenges in human rights and people dying with dignity. But I've always taken a view, and I maintain that view, that talking about the beginning or the end of life in the context of rights is very challenging. That doesn't mean I don't think there is a rights dimension to them. There absolutely is. But there is a contest of rights around people's right to life and making sure that people who wish to die with dignity do so with full consent and making sure that they're fully aware of the consequences of their actions. Are there ways that can be done? I don't dispute that's possible. I don't think we've had a robust enough discussion to flesh that out in Australia. I know that the vast majority of Australians believe in euthanasia, but in practice we haven't really had that discussion around what type of law and how can that be achieved and how can the safeguards be in place, because in practice any life lost, unless it's completely consensual and completely voluntary, is a fundamental violation of that individual's rights. And so I'm most open to having that discussion. I'm most interested in engaging with it, but it also needs to ally with what the politicians are interested in doing. I think a lot of people think that it's, human rights commissions go off and crusade one cause or another. In practice, if you want to affect change, you've got to be mindful of what's happening in the political sphere, what you can affect change, and where there are people to work with. And there isn't much interest in that in the issue of euthanasia at the moment, whereas there is interest in issues around end-of-life care, for instance, in the Victorian Parliament at the moment.
It's an interesting debate, isn't it? Because we frequently make that difficult choice for our pets, for animals. Is there a circumstance in which you'd support voluntary assisted death?
I think that the scenario is broadly yes, but I don't have the answer about how you could do it. Now, of course, in practice, we know it happens already. It's outside the law. It occurs in certain ways where certain doctors prescribe medication, knowing full well what the consequences of them are. But from a rights-based perspective, I think it's enormously challenging to argue it simply from the idea of dying is a fundamental human right. That isn't the case. It's much more of an issue of laws and safeguards to make sure that the rights of people who wish to continue to live are never violated.
Thank you very much. And thank you too, Sarah, for your thoughtful contribution. We're grateful. Well, our next questioner is is actually Steve. We've got a couple of people who've come through, and we're going to go to Steve, who's talking about Steve Weller, in fact, who is going to talk to us about the impact of wireless communication technologies. Steve.
Hi, Tim. The right to health is the right to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. This right, amongst others, is being seriously challenged when it comes to the indiscriminate deployment of Wi-Fi, mobile phone towers, smart meters near or in our homes, schools, hospitals and other public areas. There are a large number of people, including me, who are suffering from these ubiquitous wireless emissions, which have been classified as a potential carcinogen by the World Health Organization in 2011. Those who are impacted are currently being ignored by the government. They're being labelled and ridiculed, effectively having their freedoms and rights trampled. Sufferers lack accessibility to a safe environment, which often leads to discriminatory behaviour. My question to you as the Freedom Commissioner is whether you will look into claims of people's health being impacted by this technology, and will you support the establishment of white zones, so no radio frequency transmitters, for those who find themselves disabled by this man-made source of electromagnetic radiation?
Well, so last year, thanks for the question, last year I ran a national consultation going around the country talking to people about the human rights issues that exist across Australia. And I'll confess that this is the first time that this issue has been raised with me from all of my public engagements. So I think it would be perhaps inappropriate for me to give a hard and fast answer. I would actually have to go back and look at it. So if you've got any information, my email address is very public. You can send it to tim.wilson@humanrights.gov.au and bring it to my attention and I'll have a look at it. But the short answer is I think it's unlikely I'm going to look at it. And there's a reason, not because of not an absence of interest. It's because the Human Rights Commission simply doesn't have the technical capacity really to look at these sorts of issues. We can, of course, run an inquiry looking at the health consequences, but there needs to be a substantial basis of health research that sits behind it. And as the question is acknowledged, it's one of these things that may potentially occur, which is very different from can occur, and therefore there's hard evidence.
I think the point that Steve's making, though, is that the World Health Organisation has actually...
potential.
They have actually done... There's been a series of tests and research data around this. Often some of those research models and investigations are actually done by industry themselves. So that's where a lot of the contention actually comes from. I mean, and people... do feel quite legitimately in some cases that there are health impacts of various technologies, power lines, smart meters, fluoride. I mean, even wind farms, people are very concerned. I know
there are a lot of questions around fluoride that was submitted as well.
Well, but do we need better health processes? I think that's what Steve's getting at. Do we need better health processes, which does come into the issue about human rights, our own human rights to be in a safe environment?
Well, he was asking an explicit question, which was actually about that particular, the general issue, as well as about safe zones. And again, that would heavily be informed by the evidence, but there are other human rights considerations that need to come into this as well, around property rights and people's capacity to be able to live in spaces as they see fit, and they can decide what they want to do on their land. This is one of these great challenges of the collective rights or collective arrangements and individual rights, about how much you can live in a society free from the consequences of other people's activities. That is a regular contest. Does health play a part in that? Of course it does, ranging from how much do you have a right to be able to walk in a public space and not walk past somebody who's, perhaps got exhaling fumes because they're smoking cigarettes, all the way to different types of pollution and how much that affects on somebody's health. Is that a consideration? Yes. But does the relationship between an externality and somebody's direct health need to be, and the proportionate relation of that, necessary to prompt violating somebody else's rights and stopping them doing something else? Absolutely.
I'm not sure so can you perhaps explain a little bit more about where the violation of other people's rights might come into that?
Firstly, Wi-Fi, for instance, is in one sense an exercise of somebody else's rights, about them owning property, them being able to use that property as they see fit, to engage in all types of communication. I mean, there's even free speech elements to it as well. So if you want a zone or a place which is completely free of that type of electromagnetic communication, you really are asking to be completely socially isolated from other people. It's not something that is easily straightforward, at least when you've got things like telecommunications towers all over the place, because of course they enable people to do other things as well. So if you want to be able to live free of interference of others, essentially you've actually got to go and live in the country or live further away. In the same way that we all have to deal to a certain extent with air pollution because people drive cars and those sorts of things. So if there's a direct and explicit harm backed up by hard evidence, then we have to look at managing those risks, but there's only a certain extent you can do it before you start violating on the rights of others, and that's why we deal with regulations to manage that tension.
Part of that extrapolation of that argument, though, is that some of that data and some of that research indicates that we won't actually know what the impact of some of those things are until much later on.
There are lots of things we don't know about the future, and this goes in all areas of public policy. So the absence of something concrete can't just be the basis in which we turn around and say, we are going to tell other people how to live their lives because of a speculative risk. You need hard evidence to justify it, and that is part of the course of the long march of human progress, is learning about these issues, dealing with issues of injustice, building the case, information and knowledge, and managing the tension of technology.
The Human Rights Commissioner Tim Wilson is with us as part of this inaugural of this series of the Our Say online democracy forums. We've had fantastic response to, crowdsourcing questions for this particular series this week and our guest this week. And one of the very high polling questions came from Gordon Rowland. I'm not sure that we've actually got Gordon yet, but we do have Gordon. Gordon has a question on the decriminalisation of marijuana. Gordon.
My question, Tim, is in light of the fact that between them, alcohol and tobacco account for 97% of drug-related deaths, and cannabis for none, may we count on your support for adult Australians to use cannabis should they wish to do so without fear of prosecution?
Tim.
Well, all societies make judgments about what is legal and illegal based on proportionate harm. So as a society, in fact, I don't think we may do, we, for instance, would limit nuclear weapons and people being able to own their nuclear weapons because the cost is massively disproportionate to any claimed benefit of people being able to own them. And as you go through the scales, we get down to guns and those types of things, and then different types of illicit drugs as well. But death is only one way you measure the consequences of certain types of products. And we know full well that there are other health consequences allied directly to the consumption of cannabis. And I've seen some of those things firsthand in people I've known, and anyone who's seen issues around schizophrenia or etc., they're very serious and very real. But does that mean that you can automatically make something unlawful? No, because there are equally huge societal impacts, as well as on individuals who are consumers of illicit substances by making them illegal. And you see that in terms of crime and other issues around quality, which can lead to people overdosing on particular types of products or taking things which they don't know what the ingredients are and potentially having very serious negative health impact as well. So cannabis is one of those ones that sits on the line. And I think everybody acknowledges it sits in that area. But I think what we're making as a society is a positive step in trying to understand what contribution cannabis can play in terms of issues around health and well-being when people are sick, and in terms of pain management and everything else. That is the context in which I'm mentioning it. And I think that's an experiment. I think it's an experiment that other countries have gone through, that we're going through. We need to test that, and we need to look at how we're going to roll that out, because in the end, like a lot of the other questions, it comes down to evidence. You know, should people have a right to decide how to live their lives? Unquestionably, yes. Are there limits to that, particularly around certain products or goods because of the disproportionate impact on the individual? Equally, yes. We should deal with these things in caution. We should deal with them incrementally based on the evidence to make sure that we can make a proper assessment about how we're going to weight those consequences both for the individual and society.
It's an interesting question from Gordon, and it's been an interesting debate, and it's been a debate that we've been having for some time now.
Yes.
Because the world's richest and arguably the world's freest nation, the United States, has decriminalised marijuana in a number of states in the last year. Why not here? Why wouldn't we follow Uncle Sam on this one?
Well, and a lot of those states that started in the medical realm and then moved it on into a broader decriminalisation. Portugal has done its own thing with decriminalisation of certain illicit drugs, and we're still seeing what the consequences of those things are. I mean, Australia, by its nature, has a very conservative political system.
Yeah, I mean, are we just not ready for it? Is that what you...
I think it requires further engagement and discussion, and that's not to try and put it off. I'm quite open about having this discussion, but it needs to be on the basis of research and evidence to inform our decision making. That shouldn't determine the outcome, because freedom is a very important part of that discussion, and its own in terms of people being able to decide how to live their lives. But we should have an informed discussion. And to be quite frank, there's been very little leadership in the political class around these issues generally. We're starting to see it in the medical cannabis space, but it hasn't occurred more broadly than that. And I think it's going to be step by step, because any change like that has to take the community with it. And it doesn't matter what type of societal change, if it's to enjoy ongoing acceptance beyond the initial time frame of when it's introduced, particularly when there are deleterious negative consequences. We know with the legalisation of some drugs like cannabis, they've got to be tested and road tested against the positives and the negatives before we go down that path.
But given alcohol and tobacco probably account for some of the most expensive public health costs, in our society, shouldn't marijuana at least be given a trial on medical basis and move toward the United States model?
That's where we're heading, certainly, in terms of trialling medical cannabis, and I think it'll be very interesting to see how that goes. I mean, it's sort of one of these challenges in a free society. Everything is legal until you make it explicitly illegal. Alcohol has always been legal. Some societies have gone down the path of prohibition, found it doesn't work very well and has all these negative consequences. We've made cannabis illegal, and now as a society we're looking at how you manage that and whether you can make it legal or remove the illegality around it. But it's got to be done incrementally, because in the end there are serious consequences potentially for some people's health. It has to be assessed based on, and engaged on by the public based against those consequences, because if not, you could very quickly see a change reverted simply because of a lack of robust understanding.
Thanks, Tim, and a terrific question, Gordon. Thanks very much. Well, we've been talking about the issues that have topped our say's online democracy, but I did want to get your thoughts on the issue that's been trending all week in our national debate in Australia, an issue you've been a passionate advocate for, and that's marriage equality. Now, you were handpicked by the Abbott government, and yet this week the Prime Minister, Tony Abbott's denied Conservative MPs a conscience vote on this issue. What's your capacity to influence government, particularly on something that you care so much about?
Well, I care so much about it and have written about this for nearly 10 years, but I also have a personal interest in it as well. What's my capacity? I think like most people, and I think like those people who are in same-sex relationships across Australia, it's really to put the human face behind the issue, and to make sure that all of the issue is explored. If people have been reading my writing recently, I've been talking explicitly about, or writing about, the implications for religious freedom and how we need to manage those tensions and have a considered discussion as part of any reform. The government has made its policy clear in the past 48 hours, 72 hours.
Has that disappointed you?
Well, it's not my first preference, and I make no reservation about that. I have a fundamental challenge with the idea that the majority of Australians, or all Australians, will get to vote on the legality and standing of other people's relationships. I think this is an issue that should be dealt with by the Parliament. That's what the Constitution makes clear. That's, my conservatism coming out. We should do what the Constitution says. But I also understand that some people feel there needs to be broader public discussion and not discussion, but public acceptance, and that some sort of plebiscite would resolve that. But I think my role, and I think the role of everybody who wants to see change, is to bring that human face to it, because I've been in a relationship now for 6 years, going on 7 years. And I've seen friends get married, divorced, and everything else in between in that time. And while my relationship has been stable and enduring, and I've always argued that same-sex couples wanting to marry is sort of the ultimate conservative victory, because people outside of social norms are fighting to have those stable, enduring relationships and to enjoy the equal protection of law. That's a very liberal and conservative aspiration for our society.
But hasn't what's occurred in the Parliament this week, driven by the Prime Minister effectively shutting down the opportunity for this to have a really genuine free vote in our Parliament, hasn't that denied Australians an opportunity for their own human right to marry?
Well, you actually don't have a human right to marry.
Well,
this is where the language of human rights is often contorted.
It denied them the choice and the opportunity that people in heterosexual relationships enjoy.
Let us not lose sight and perspective on this issue. It was 30 years ago, and we're in the great state of Victoria right now, that the state of Victoria decriminalised homosexuality. So people used to be thrown in prison for having the relationship.
I know the history of it. It's actually about.
It is important, and so it is frustrating for many people.
Yeah.
Around this, but we also have made huge strides All the position of the federal government now is to say that we will have a free vote after the election and we'll put it to the public plebiscite. The Australian Labor Party, as the alternative government, has said they will have a free vote after the next election. Are people frustrated? Undoubtedly. Am I frustrated? Honestly, I am. But I'm also an optimist because I think whether we go down the free vote in the parliament or we go down the path of having a plebiscite, what people see is the common humanity when they look in the eyes of their friends, their families, their peers, their colleagues, and they see people who have exactly the same aspirations and hopes as themselves, and that provides the building block and the stability that provides the foundations for the rest of our society. And that's what I think people will notice when it comes to their decision on this issue.
Do you think we'll get there?
I have no doubt about that. In fact, I'm a great optimist generally, but I'm particularly optimistic about this issue precisely for those reasons, because it is not a radical proposition that people want to build stable and enduring relationships. It's actually a deeply conservative one.
In a broader sense, in your role as Human Rights Commissioner, what do you think is the human right that is most under threat in 2015?
It depends on who you talk to on any given day. People will give you different opinions. I think the biggest challenge we have as society now is really about people's freedom to exercise their individual rights against the tension of what we have as aspirations for our society. And I think this is becoming particularly clear around freedom of speech. And, you know, it might surprise people, but I take a polar opposite view from many other people around, for instance, the debate around marriage for same-sex couples, where people are increasingly nervous about expressing their opinion towards a different view than the one that I have just expressed. And we've seen this where television networks now are saying we won't run ads, even though all they're doing is discussing, I might agree with the content of the ads, but discussing the substance of the issue in a way and questioning whether it's worth it whether it's necessary or not. And I don't think that's a healthy thing. In any policy change, you need to hear all sides of the debate, least because it means that people feel like they've been heard if they have doubt. And we're seeing more and more of this where people are either reserved or can't get their voice out in a way, and I don't think that is healthy. And you see this with a lot of other issues as well, where people are fearful or feel that their freedom to exercise their rights is restricted. That doesn't help a cohesive society. It actually has a reverse effect, because you want people to be challenged. You want people to be to hear different ideas and to reason them away and discover what a better or more clearer truth is.
Tim Wilson, terrific to hear your views on a range of things, and thanks so much for joining us on Our Say, the online democracy forum today.
Thank you very much.
And thank you to you for being part of Our Say community and contributing to this important discussion. Thanks also to the Melbourne Hub for hosting us this afternoon. I look forward to seeing you again with the second in our series of digital democracy interviews. This program will be available as a video on demand, so have a look for it on YouTube and share it with your friends. But for now, it's goodbye.